Good evening and welcome to everyone. My name is Sue Smereck, and I'm the chairperson of the Voting Rights and Democracy Interest Group of the League of Women Voters, Washtenaw County. And tonight we are delighted to have our guest speaker, Chris Wiggins, who's going to talk to us about nonpartisan voting and ranked choice voting. Chris is an interesting fellow who's lived in a whole variety of places and has in many places here in Michigan. He's worked as a programmer, lawyer, tech consultant, contract negotiator, and manager, and a third-party risk manager. And I'm sure there are probably a couple of other things. On retirement, he thought about how great it would be to join the League of Women Voters, and his interest in our candidate forums led him to investigating further ranked choice voting and nonpartisan voting. So we're grateful to have him here, and I'm going to turn the program over to Chris.
Thank you. Let me share my screen here. So hopefully people are seeing now a screen that says all candidate primaries and ranked choice voting. And that's also called nonpartisan primaries. Why call it all candidate primaries? I'll get to it later, but essentially the same concept. But I think all candidates better describes what's going on. As Sue said, my name is Chris. I'm a member of the League of Women Voters, Oakland. I'm not sure exactly how long I've been a member. My wife joined first, and I was doing stuff in the background. And last 2023 convention, my wife was driving her as a chauffeur, and she said that, I said, well, I need to get the convention rate, so I guess I'll have to join. She said, it's taken care of. I said, when? She said, don't worry, it's taken care of. So I joined sometime in the past. I'm not. I want to be real clear on this. I am not an expert on this stuff. I'm just someone who's gone out and done some research that I want to share with you tonight. So the agenda tonight is what's the problem? What are ranked primaries and ranked choice voting? How do ranked choice voting and nonpartisan primaries solve the problems? How these problems and solutions tie into our mission as League of Women Voters, and what's coming up next. Okay, this is a slide about what's the problem. Kids talking, math teacher says, that's why no one likes math. It's a branding issue. Everything's a problem, which is kind of how I feel about our election system right now. Everything's a problem. But we're not going to talk about everything tonight. We're going to talk about just some limited number of those problems. So the first problem with our current system is that there's a substantial risk that the winner is someone that the majority opposes. Second problem is our legislatures are dysfunctional, except in times of trifectas, which are relatively rare. Safe districts disenfranchise a large percentage of voters. Less than 10% of voters select more than 70% of our legislature. Partisan primaries eliminate candidates that the majority of people want and tend to nominate candidates towards the end of the ideological spectrum. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are the ones we picked to talk about tonight because they tie into it. So first problem, substantial risk that the winner is someone that the majority does not want. So you have a winner here who's got less than 50%, and the majority of voters don't agree with this person at all. So Michigan, like almost all states, uses a plurality system to determine the winners. And a plurality means if you get more votes than any other candidate, you are the winner. No other requirement. So if you've only got two candidates, the winner definitely has a majority. But if you get three or more candidates, the plurality winner may win with less than 50% of the vote. So I've got an example here. Just Alpha has 34, 33, 33. Under a plurality system, Alpha wins with 34%. This is not a hypothetical situation. So for example, in East Point, Michigan, 2019, they had 5 candidates for mayor. The winner had 32%, a whopping 19 votes ahead of the second place finisher. there's simply no assurance that that person would have been the person who won the majority. On the other hand, if plurality always picked the same result as a runoff, there's no harm, no foul, but that's not always true. If you look at our presidential elections, which are pretty well researched, we have 7 of them, 12%, that have produced a result that the majority did not want. 5 of them is absolutely clear, and the most recent one would be from 2000, when George Bush, Al Gore, and Ralph Nader were there. If you look at it, in Florida, there were 537 votes separating Al Gore and George Bush. Ralph Nader had 97,000. So in other words, by sucking off votes from Al Gore because he was a consumer person, he managed to put the business-friendly person into the White House. Similar situation occurred in New Hampshire. Margin between Bush and Gore was 7,211 votes. Ralph Nader had 22,000. If Gore had won either of those states, he would have won the election. So that's one of those examples where we elected someone, a spoiler elected someone that the majority opposed. We have 2 more cases of this in presidential elections, the most recent one being a probable one of when we had Bill Clinton versus George Bush versus Ross Perot. So we need to change the system so that the majority isn't shut out. That's the first problem. We don't want the minority picking someone that the majority doesn't want. The second problem is that the legislature is dysfunctional. So I like this quote from Will Rogers: "This problem's not new. Tax relief, farm relief, flood relief, dam relief, none of these have been settled, but they're getting them in shape for consideration at the next session of Congress, with the hope that those needing relief will perhaps have conveniently died in the meantime." Will Rogers from 30s, but I think the situation has gotten worse. In a University of Maryland study in 2021, they found over 150 policies for the national government that majorities of Democrats, majorities of Republicans, and majorities overall supported the policies, and they covered things like immigration, defense spending, Social Security, Medicare, health insurance, wide number of things. We're going to look at the immigration one. So what they found agreement was that 68% of Democrats supported requiring using E-Verify for to make sure someone's a citizen. 80% of Republicans and 73% overall. The undocumented DACA, the DACA persons get citizenship, give them a path. 92% of Democrats, 69% of Republicans, 80% overall. We increase the number of visas for low-skilled workers in industries that need them, such as agriculture. 87% of Democrats, 66% of Republicans, 77% overall. Hire more workers to process claims of asylum seekers. 96%, 90%, 93%. These issues might look familiar, and the reason is that in 2005, Ted Kennedy and John McCain introduced a comprehensive immigration bill. All 4 of these points were inside that bill. And what's happened since 2005 to 2025? Nothing. Broad agreement, and nothing is happening. This means that Congress is absolutely broken. The primary of their job is to enact laws that reflect the will of the people they represent, and they're simply failing to do that. And there are multiple examples of this. The next problem: safe districts give a few voters generally disproportionate power. Here's Iowa's facing off to all the other states saying, over the primary choices, saying, no need to push, I'm ordering for all of you. This actually applies to primaries more generally. The great majority of legislative seats, whether we're talking nationally or in Michigan, are safe for either one party, Democrats or Republicans. And by safe, I mean that there's a greater than a 45-55% advantage. So Michigan House District 49, 45% Democrat, 55% Republican, safe Republican seat. Michigan House District 1, 90.5%, 9.5%. This is a safe Democratic seat. Nationally, if you look at US House seats, 87%, 380 of the 465 are safe for one party or the other. In Michigan, if you look at the Michigan House seats, 78 of the 110, that's 71%, are safe for one party or the other. And in the Senate, 79% of them are safe. Now, these are the new districts that have been created by the Redistricting Commission, and I want to be real clear that this is not a problem with the Redistricting Commission. Their criteria did not include solving this problem. They if you look at the list of priorities, they met it fairly well. And the other problem is if you want to solve this so that you don't have these wildly this large number of districts, you would have to break one of the rules and start putting together non-contiguous districts, like take part of Detroit and pair it with part of the UP, which if that ever happens, I don't want to be in the middle because I hear that both sides are heavily armed. In safe districts, the primaries pick the election winners. So the first thing is I want to be real clear that these safe districts are really, really safe. So in the Michigan House, using that definition of it, in 2024, the winner in the safe district was a dominant party 100% of the time. In 2022, the Michigan Senate was 100% accurate. I can't do the Michigan House from 2022, but I'm pretty sure it's the same because they took down the partisan balance sheet. So what this means in these safe districts, as soon as you know who wins the dominant party's primary, you know who's going to win the election. The other part is that I want to point out is that Fair Vote in 2022, 2 years before the 24 elections, predicted with 100% accuracy the results of the 2024 US House races for what they saw as a 407 900 competitive seats in the US House. They didn't know who was running, they didn't know who the issues were. All they knew was this is a Republican district or this is a Democratic district. And based upon that, they projected the winners, and they're right. So let's look at some particular examples here of safe districts. So Michigan House District 3, safe Democratic seat, 2075-25. In 2024, the primary had 3 candidates. It was an open seat. So you had 3,033 votes for the winner, 2451 for second place, 64. A little less than majority, but almost a majority. Those 3,033 voters right here, 4% of the persons of voting age in that district picked who is going to represent the 92,000 people in that district. Michigan House District 50, safe seat for Republicans. This was also an open seat. It had 4 candidates. The winner here had 4,723 votes, 33% of the Republican votes in the primary. Those 4,723 voters picked who was going to represent 90,000 people. So what happens if you take the votes for the winners of this primary and look at it nationally and see what happens? Well, this is what happens. In 2024, 87% of the US House was elected by 7% of Americans. In Michigan primaries, 5.6% of Michigan voters elected 71% of the Michigan House. I don't know how we can call ourselves a democracy when we have this few voters having this much influence on the results of who's representing us in our government. The next problem is that the partisan primaries eliminate safe districts, disenfranchise a large number of voters. If you go back to those districts, 1/4 of Michigan's people of voting age live in a Michigan House district, but it's safe for the party that they disagree with. 1/4. And they have absolutely no influence over who represents them. And I like this cartoon. Do we want a democracy where every vote counts, or where we just count every vote? And right now, all we're doing is counting every vote and moving on. We're leaving these folks without representation or influence. The next problem I mentioned is that partisan primaries nominate candidates from the edges of the US ideological spectrum. So this is a longer story, but let me start off here. Voter ideology in the US is absolutely stable. This comes from Pew Research and going from 1996 to 2023. And if you look at the moderates, it's 37, 35, 36, 36, 36, 35, 36 plus or minus one most of the years. If you look at those persons who think themselves liberal, 17, 16, 17, 17, 16, very close. If you look at the persons who are mildly conservative, it goes 26, 26, 26, 27, 26. And you've got the extremes on both ends. So we've been very, very stable. Well, let's look at the US Senate to see what happens. And this comes from the Washington Post. In 1982, if you had looked at the number of members of the US Senate who were between the most liberal Republican and the most conservative Democrat, 58 members of the US Senate were in that branch. By 1994, it shrunk to 34. By 2002, it shrunk to 7, and by 2013, it disappeared. How in the world, if we're so stable, did we wind up with changing such very different candidates? And the answer must be that the candidates have changed. So let's look to see. I don't have history data, but I can tell you how it works today. Partisan primary voters are ideologically different from the US and somewhat from their party. So if you look at the Democrats here, I've got the same range of the red being very conservative and this being very liberal. In the primary, if you look at it, the liberal plus the very liberal winds up to being 60% of the Democratic vote in that primary. They're only 50% of the Democratic Party, so it's fairly close, but they're only 26% of the US population. Republicans are worse in the sense of the difference. If you look at their primary, 73% are conservative or very conservative, which is actually fairly close to the 69% of the party as a whole. But the country as a whole, we're not 73, we're 37%. So those voters are very different. Now, what happens into a per candidate? Well, you have to win a primary to win an election. And so the winning strategy is to be someplace around the middle of the primary voters. Because if you're up here, you're going to lose all these votes, you're going to lose. Or if you're down here, you're going to lose all these votes up here. You need to be around in the middle of the stuff. And this is what being primary means, is you're out of step with the voters in the primary. So where does the middle of those primary voters wind up on the national scale? Well, the middle of the Democratic Party primary voters has 20% to the left and 80% to the right. The middle of the Republican primary voters has 18% to the right and 82% to the left. That's where our candidates are coming from, because you have to win there to get to the general election. This is why parties have turned to the middle and switched to get out the base. And both of them are doing it because that's a winning strategy. I get out my base, leave the other people in the middle. And when I look at this chart, I would like you to think about a quote from John Adams in Thoughts in Government, 1776. The greatest care should be employed in constituting this representative assembly. It should be, in miniature, an exact portrait of the people at large. It should think, feel, reason, and act like them. I know they're not like us. I don't think they think, feel, reason, and act like us. They're simply not part of us. So when you look, we have examples here of where partisan primaries eliminate candidates in majority. I have actual examples. So Joe Lieberman was primaried out in 2006, but won the general election. Leah Murkowski was primaried out in 2010, but she won the general election on a write-in campaign. And then I'd like to tell the story about Dan Newhouse. He's a Republican, a US representative for Washington. He's one of the persons that voted to impeach Donald Trump. So Republicans rolled out a real Republican the next time, and the primary, Dan Newhouse actually finished second, about 10% percentage points behind the real Republican. But Washington runs a top two primary where they don't run separate ones, they run one. And so the top two candidates, so he wasn't eliminated in the primary, but he would have been under the traditional partisan primary. He went to the general election, and instead of losing by 10%, he won by about 10%. The person that the people wanted would have been eliminated by a partisan primary. So coming back to these problems, we're electing people the majority don't want. The legislature is dysfunctional. Safe districts disenfranchise a large number of voters. They give a disproportionate weight to some primary voters. And partisan primaries eliminate candidates that in some districts the majority of the people want. And they nominate candidates from the ideological edges of the US who are not exactly known for working well together. So what are all candidate primaries and ranked choice voting? So let me show you. This is my primary ballot from this last fall. So there was a Democratic section, a Republican Party section, and a nonpartisan section. And so what you do is you can vote all the nonpartisan sections and you pick one side of this and you vote down one column. An all candidates primary would look like this. You have just a list of offices, and then underneath the offices, you have a list of all the candidates for the party, along with the party name that they're coming from. And that's what makes it different from a pure nonpartisan one. We don't identify the party here. Over here, we identify the party. When you go into this booth as a voter, you no longer are picking a side, you are picking who you think is the best candidate for that office. And the other difference from this primary is that instead of advancing one winner, you advance more than one. So California and Washington, I mentioned before, advanced two candidates from the primary. Alaska goes with top four. The recommendation is top five because you leave room for hopefully a third party. How you decide that number? So let me tell you how Alaska, which runs a top four primary, got to it. I got a chance to speak to the one of the persons who founded that movement in Alaska, and he had founded one to put in ranked choice voting, and the chief of staff for the ex-governor had started off a separate petition drive to create open primaries. Well, they got together in a bar, Alaska bar, one evening to discuss whether they should combine. And they quickly realized they should. There's just too much synergy between the two. And when the problem was that, as the one said, but you want two people in your open primaries, and I want 5 people over here. And 5 is the average for that is 3.5, and I don't think we're going to go with 3.5 candidates. So the other guy said, "Well, tell you what, if you buy the next round of beer, we can have." And after that extensive data analysis and next round of beer, that's how they got to 4. Which shows you how some of these decisions are made. Okay, so we got past the primary. What does the general election look like? This is actually the Alaska ballot from this year, from last November. For the US Senate, you have the top 4 candidates that came out of the primary, and then you leave room for a write-in. So that's what the ballot looks like. Now, how does this work? So this is where the clip is playing.
Alaskans will use ranked choice voting in general elections for federal and state races. Instead of choosing just one candidate, you fill in the oval in column 1 for the candidate you would most like to win. Then vote for your second choice in column 2, and so on. Ranking other candidates does not impact your first choice, but you don't have to rank them all. For your vote to count, you should mark only one oval in each row and one oval in each column. We take the ballots and count all the first choices. If a candidate gets at least half of the votes in round one, they win. If this doesn't happen, we continue to round two, and the candidate with the least first choice votes is eliminated. We count the voters' next remaining candidate choice instead of their choice for the eliminated candidate, meaning they still have a say in who wins. We repeat these steps in rounds until there are only two candidates left. Whoever has the most votes wins. That's how ranked choice voting works. Check out our website and follow us on social media to make sure you're ready to rank it up, Alaska.
So that clip was actually prepared by the Alaska State Secretary as part of preparing Alaskan voters to use ranked choice voting in 2022. They did a terrific job in coming together to produce that because they had actually fewer ballots spoiled in that first election with the new voting method than they did under the traditional stuff. So now that you know what it is, kind of, let's talk about how all candidate primaries and ranked choice voting solve those problems I mentioned. Remember I said I've talked about a minority winner. Well, we've solved it because by definition, ranked choice voting, you have to have a candidate to win, has to have a majority of the active voters to win. Now, the active votes is a key qualifier here because if you've only got 3 or 4 candidates, you're probably good that winning candidate, you're going to go 1 or 2 rounds, and that person probably will have a majority of all the ballots. If you have 13 or whatever, 10, then a lot of ballots are going to become exhausted. And it's quite likely that the eventual winner, if you go 8 or 9 rounds, will not have a majority of all votes, but they will have a majority of the active votes at the end that are needed to win. So I just want to be clear about that because some people thought, well, it's a fake majority. It's not a fake majority. It's a real majority of the people who have cared to go that far out. One of the other questions I sometimes get asked, and I'm going to do it right now, well, why not do a runoff? It turns out that runoffs actually have a much sharper drop-off in general. So that, for example, from 1994 to 2022, there were 276 runoffs and primaries for the U.S. House and U.S. Senate. In 266, 96% of them, fewer people voted in the second round than the first, and the median decline in turnout was 40%. There's been no ranked choice voting where you've had a decline of 40%. Problem, many voters disenfranchised. Well, I've solved. Because of this, that 1.9 million districts of persons, what they would do is that they would go in and they would rank their preferred candidate first, and knowing that they're going to lose, they would then have the option of picking another voter to come in. And the same person who told me the story about how they got 4 told me about his vote last year in the election. He said, Chris, I am not a fan of Lisa Murkowski because I'm a liberal Democrat. So I voted for the Democrat first round. But Lisa Murkowski was far better than any of the other persons on it. And so she was my number 2 choice, and she was the eventual winner. I asked him whether he rated anyone else. He said, no, none of the rest of them were worth it. But that he had a voice in who represented him only because of ranked choice voting. Small number of voters in primaries pick greater majority of legislatures. Well, I've solved that too, or these solved that. I don't pick a single winner. I advance multiple winners to the general candidate. And so there's no more automatic winner. I've won this because I'm in a Democratic district and I'm the Democratic candidate. That happens to be, just takes it away. And yes, it does mean in some elections that you might have 2 persons from the same party. So for example, if you were really to do an all candidates primary in New York City, I feel positive that all of the candidates who advance to the final round would be Democrats. And that's a better choice for the people of New York City than having someone called Sue was running and collecting 30% of the vote. It's a meaningless election. Move it back, give us all a choice about what we want. The second part of this is that it's a really interesting side effect that the most thorough study shows that when you run these open primaries, that you wind up with about 6% more people voting in the elections, in the primary election. And the 6% is an interesting number to me because LWV National looked at the states where the presidential winner was known versus those where it wasn't. And what they found was there was a 6% decline in voter participation when they were in a league that a state, excuse me, when they were in a state that the winner was already known. So the 6% kind of match. What it's saying is if people know it doesn't make a difference, they have no motivation to go out and vote. The motivation in these non-partisan primaries, I want to look here at Washington, which is exceptionally high, which is why I picked it. But you can see these rates here of participation. This is for a primary. This is higher than our participation in the general election was in 2020. And you can see it's consistently much higher. Same is true for California. Problem: partisan primaries eliminate candidates that the majority of the voters want. Well, it's solved. You can't just beat the candidate in a plurality primary because if you're advancing two or more, you have to make sure they're out of the range of it. So if you have in a nonpartisan primary, the example was Newhouse was beaten, but he advanced since he was number 2 in the top primary. In a top 5 primary, it's even more difficult because if someone has 20%, more than 20% backing, they're going to make it to that final ballot. And there's no way in the world that you can keep someone who's got broad support from picking up 20%. Another way that these people advance sometimes is simply because of criteria. So if you were advancing a top 4 or top 5, either Lieberman or Murkowski would have advanced from their primaries to the general election because there were fewer candidates overall than the 4 or 5. Same thing is we have an example of this in Michigan in Peter Meyer in the 3rd Congressional District. There were only 2 candidates in the Republican and 1 in the Democrat. If you're advancing 4, he would have advanced to the final election. And even if you would only advance 2, the question is, which we'll never know, would there have been some of those Democrats who came over to support Meyer that would have put him in the final because it was only a pittance of a couple, 3,000 votes, a few thousand votes that separated Meyer from his Republican candidate. So they can't just throw in this candidate primary people out of the party scan. Only advanced candidates from the ideological edges. Well, if you think about that top 2, 4, or 5, it's clear to me that Murkowski, Lieberman, Newhouse, and Meyer would or did broaden the choices in the general election that were available to voters without them. So we're going to have more choices come fall. This last one is the legislature dysfunction, which is probably the most important one because we need to start being able to solve problems. All candidate primaries change campaigns fundamentally. This comes from Danielle Allen, who's a professor at Harvard, specializing in democracy renovation. So what happens to a candidate who's got this all candidate primary is they have to change from targeting the base of people who vote in primary elections to looking at the entire range. And some wonderful stories. There's a documentary out on East Point that talks about a candidate who they ran ranked choice voting elections for 6 years. She ran for the city council under both the old and the new. And what she said was that under the old system, she would drive up to the end of the block. And she had a list of addresses from her party, and she would visit those houses on the street. When she had to run underneath the all candidate primary, she would pull up to the end of the street and she would visit every house because she'd say, I can see from the signs out front, I'm not your first choice, but let me explain to you why I think I might be the second choice. So the targeting changed and whole new avenues of communication opened up that don't exist under our current system. The same story is repeated in Alaska. The head of the Alaska Senate was primaried out in 2020. In 2022, when they put in the non-partisan candidates, nonpartisan primaries, she ran and she won. And she's, by the way, got elected to be president of the U.S. Senate, of the Alaska Senate again. And she tells the same story about how campaigning is different. There's also a wonderful clip out there from a California legislator. Same thing. I have to cater to everybody in the population and what everybody cares about, not just what those primary voters care about. And as a result of that, this is a second shift, which you change from negative campaigning to issue campaigning. In this very heavily Democratic or Republican district, all you have to do is get people angry at the other side or upset at the other side. And those are the easiest human emotions to activate. And that's what we do. It's called getting out the base, and it's usually done with all things about how the other side is evil or whatever. When you're talking to the whole base, they don't care which party is evil. They care about, what are you going to do about this, my issue here at this house? What are you going to do about these pieces of the stuff? And it reduces that negativity, and you have to start focusing on issues that are the interests of everybody, not just the primary voters. Because you're accountable to that coalition of people that elected you, which is no longer just that small segment. Kind of the proof of the pudding here is Nebraska. It has a unicameral, nonpartisan legislature since 1934. There was a Republican Progressive Center who said, looked at the way that parties were going. He said, if we keep going this way, the candidates are going to care only about the parties and not the people. So he engaged on a campaign for the Nebraska House to combine it into one, because he also didn't want to spend extra money, and put it in. And the only names are on the ballots. There's no party labels, although as one of the persons I saw said, but everybody knows who's what. So in 2015, there was a report that about some legislation that the Nebraska legislature, which was 71% Republican, had just passed. They'd abolished the death penalty. They'd authorized driver's license for dreamers. They raised the gas tax to fund some critical infrastructure improvements. And they put on the ballot raising the minimum wage, which eventually passed. And when you look at these and say, how did these become conservative? I liked really one of the quotes of the persons there who said, who was a conservative, there were obvious other persons, but the conservative Republican who was voting for said, if anyone else had, looking at the death penalty, if anything else was this costly, this ineffective, and this error prone, would have gotten rid of it a long time ago. Getting rid of it sounds pretty conservative to me. That type of thinking can thrive when you're focusing on the issues and not what your party thinks. And the real proof of this comes looking at Nebraska's U.S. senators and representatives. They're elected under a traditional partisan primary system. And none of the Republicans in U.S. Congress supported any of these issues in 2015, none of them. And the report concludes that Nebraska serves as evidence that under a nonpartisan system, debates over issues prevail over partisan politics, even in a state heavily dominated by one political party. We have examples and we know it works. So how do these things tie to our mission, which is empowering voters and defending democracy? In a primary, we're empowering voters because you vote for who you think is the best candidate. No more of these game shifts about, well, I may have to vote for this person here or that person and give up my votes to the other side. You vote for who's the best person. It also empowers us as voters because we select who are going to be the group of candidates, not that we're going to pick the one Republican or one Democrat. Who are the best candidates to be on that ballot in fall? And in a general election, all voters have a say in who represents them. What that means for me is that those 24% of Michigan voters who are currently disenfranchised because of being caught trapped in a district and they voting for the loser, expanding and giving them a voice in who represents them will be the second largest expansion of voting rights since we passed the 19th Amendment. We're defending democracy. Is there any more core principle for democracy than majority rule? I don't think so. The other part is that the nonpartisan primaries make candidates responsible to all voters instead of the people who show up for the primaries. It increases the number of voters who selected candidates for the general election. It eliminates the disproportionate impact of primary voters. It keeps on the ballots of candidates that we want to represent us. And because we're electing legislators who can reach out to the other side without getting primaried out, the legislature can start to work again. What's next in Michigan? Right, Michigan has a proposal that they're trying to get on the ballot that would create ranked choice voting only in the primaries and general elections. The U.S. has adopted a position supporting ranked choice voting in the state and local level, but they're not taking a position on the federal level. We in Michigan, I've been informed unofficially that we will be voting on updating our election ballot language at the convention. I'm hoping that you all will support that. And I also hope that this is giving you some information so that when you have to make decisions for yourselves or about what you will do or whatever, that this has provided some help.